Hello, and welcome to the Big Five podcast from Northumbria Psychology Department. My name is Dr. Genevieve Brown, and I'll be your guide into the minds of psychology students, alumni, and researchers at Northumbria University. I'm a lecturer and researcher in the psychology department. Each week on this podcast, I'll speak to a guest who is either a student, alumni, or researcher in the Northumbria Psychology Department. By asking them 5 big questions, we'll learn about their time studying psychology and hopefully learn some big facts about human behavior and experience. This month, we'll be specifically discussing several opportunities for funded PhD studentships, and the researchers who will be supervising these PhDs will come tell us about their work and how the PhD will extend their research. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to my guest, Dr. Alyson Dodd. Hello, Alyson.
Hi.
Alyson is an associate professor in the psychology department and is on the leadership team for the SMART Network for Student Wellbeing in the UK. She's one of the researchers who will be supervising a PhD. Her work focuses on student well-being and mental health. Your work is very relevant right now. There's lots of discussions in the media about student mental health and how students are struggling. So can you tell us a little bit about why you got interested in this topic and some of the theories that you use in your research?
Yeah, sure. So actually, I came into this in a bit of a roundabout way. My research background originally and still is on emotion regulation and bipolar disorder. So by emotion regulation, I mean how people think about and respond to how they're feeling, their everyday emotions and moods, and how that then has a subsequent impact on how they're feeling. And as part of that, I really started to get interested not just in people who had a diagnosis of a mental health condition like bipolar disorder, but younger people who are at risk of developing mental health problems. And as you will know, Genevieve, in psychology, we often by default recruit students into what we call analog studies or non-clinical studies, where we look at kind of clinical phenomena in a non-clinical group to understand those processes a bit better. And that just kind of got me to think, well, you know, we end up with these student populations in this research, these student samples, not particularly representative really of the general population the way we want it to be. And actually students are a very specific group. They're kind of typically passing through the peak age of onset for a number of severe mental health difficulties. And they also have really unique factors that influence their mental health and well-being. So I kind of went from recruiting them as a kind of general population, non-clinical group in my research on emotion regulation into being more interested in, like I say, those kind of risk and resilience factors for mental health that are very specific to the student experience. So now I have my bipolar disorder and emotion regulation research hat and also this separate research stream specifically on student mental health and well-being. And my work there has primarily looked at what well-being means in student populations and what key people, including students themselves, think we should be asking about when it comes to student well-being, with that kind of overall view that there may be very specific needs and precipitating factors for difficulties in students compared to other groups, including similar age peers who are not attending universities, because of the different challenges and life circumstances and pressures that students often face, including transitions from school and college into university, often leaving home for the first time, deadlines, all of those things that, you know, we're aware that students are always passing through while they go through their studies. And I think in terms of theoretical perspectives there, one of the key things that has driven my work on student mental health and well-being is actually the separation of mental health and well-being, where we can view them as separate continua, very linked, obviously highly correlated with each other, strong relationships between the two, but where mental health can be viewed as kind of a continuum from having mental health difficulties through to less severe difficulties to not having difficulties at all. Whereas well-being is arguably a construct that's about a lot of different things, including emotions, including life satisfaction, how people feel they're getting on in relationships, and so on and so forth. So I've kind of come from that broad theoretical perspective, which is contentious. Not everybody thinks that they're separable like that. And as I say, I don't think they're completely separable, but when I talk about student well-being, I mean something different to what I mean when I say student mental health.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. So, what are some of these methodologies of studies that you talked about? You said that you actually ask students what well being means to them. And are there any specific methods that you use to do that?
Yeah, sure. So it's really interesting again, because it's kind of a swerve away from my initial research trajectory, where I was primarily a quantitative researcher and had done very little qualitative work. Whereas with my research on student wellbeing, primarily that has been qualitative, where I've actually spoken to students. So to give an example, I got funding from the British Academy to investigate what matters to students when they think about their quality of life. So in order to be living the good life, what are the factors that kind of influence that, and what would they need to be satisfied with across these different life domains in order to feel like their quality of life was good. So we interviewed students one-to-one and then ran some focus groups to really get a picture of what students think is important to their quality of life. So that's one key methodology that I've used. For work with Smarten, which you mentioned earlier, I did a scoping review. So that basically meant looking at all the published work on university student wellbeing in the UK, looking at how wellbeing is defined and measured by researchers and by relevant organisations, looking at student wellbeing when they're doing research on this topic. And we found a really mixed bag in terms of both how wellbeing is conceptualised, so how people define it in students, and what people use to measure it. So all sorts of different measures and questionnaires, a real lack of consistency across there. So in tandem with that, we also ran a consultation, an online consultation, where we spoke to key people, including students. I say spoke to, it was online, but we basically asked students and people working in higher education and people working in relevant organisations such as the voluntary sector, policy and so on, if we're going to measure student mental health, what do you think is important? Like, what are the key constructs that we should be looking at in order to get this full picture of student wellbeing? We kind of looked at in tandem with the scoping review to see where were the overlaps. So hot off the press, that report will be out very soon.
Oh, exciting. Might have to link to it in the show notes. I'm curious about what you said about what students said versus what researchers think. So, is there anything exciting or surprising that you learned when you heard the student answers versus what kind of experts in the field said? And is there anything that you think researchers should pay more attention to?
So actually we found that there was quite a lot of overlap across the different groups of people that we asked. So those groups were people working in student services, researchers and academics, people working in linked organisations that aren't actually in universities but are relevant to universities, and of course students themselves. So the key factors across the board that people said we should be measuring and looking at when we're investigating student wellbeing were what's known as hedonic wellbeing, which is very much positive/negative emotions and life satisfaction. Eudaimonic wellbeing, which is about things such as feeling like I was saying before, about relationships are positive, you're achieving what you want to achieve, and so on. Social support, coping, so kind of feeling able to cope and feeling that you have those coping strategies that you need to get by with both university life and non-university life. And self-belief, so things like self-esteem and self-efficacy and so on. So I think the only difference with students when looking across the different groups individually is that they didn't seem to value the self-beliefs as much in terms of measuring well-being. But for that group, there were two things that were equally important to the student group that didn't really creep in with the other groups, and that was sleep. So feeling like sleep was adequate and so on, and work-life balance. And that actually, interestingly, is something that also came up in a number of different projects I've done relevant to both student mental health and student wellbeing. When you speak to students about their experiences of wellbeing, they always talk about or at least in my experience, they always talk about that importance of finding a balance between studies, work, social life, other commitments, extracurricular activities, feeling like I need to be doing all of these things to both have the best university experience possible, to do as well as I can do in my degree, but also to get all those great things on my CV for future employability, while also like having a social life. That comes up time and time again, that notion of finding a balance. It was one of the key things that came up in the Student Quality of Life project as well, as something that's just seemed really crucial to students. So I guess that's not that surprising, but it has been a really consistent finding that I have found across all different projects with different groups of students.
I'm curious about this idea of work-life balance, and sleep, these things that students are interested in. Do you have any ideas of how these findings might impact policy in the future, or things that universities could implement to help students improve these areas of their well-being?
Yeah, well, interestingly, one of the other projects that I worked on that involved consulting with students about their own priorities was this key questions project through Smarten. And again, one of the important research questions that students were saying, when you are doing research on our student mental health and well-being, we want you to look at this. And one of them, again, was that work-life balance, finding a balance. So I think it's quite an untapped area. We know that students get very stressed, they have deadlines, they experience all of these things, but not that much has been done, to my knowledge, about what we can actually do to tackle that. And I do think that's a really important area. We can't change that, really. We can't change the demands of student life, but what we can do is equip students with the ability to feel like they're better able to manage that. I think that's probably a crucial thing to be looking at. And as part of that, actually, the importance of having a routine and so on, and sleep feeds into that quite nicely. So I know that there is a body of research going on around sleep and actually supporting students with their sleep through interventions. I'm not involved in that, but that research is happening. So I think those are really important things moving forward. In terms of the importance of my own work in the area already, I think that the focus on defining and measuring facets of student well-being, it sometimes doesn't sound that exciting. Like, how do you define a concept and how do you measure it? The kind of notion of conceptualization and operationalization, as we'll say in psychology. But actually, when we've talked to students, people working in higher education, it's meant that we've been able to produce this document that I spoke about, this guidance document, which will hopefully help people to make really informed decisions about how they measure well-being in the student population. So that could ultimately help people to understand the concept of well-being, how it may or may not differ from mental health, encourage us to use more appropriate means of measuring student well-being in line with student priorities, what's important to them, what do they want to change, what's important for them to feel good about in terms of good well-being, and yeah, take a consistent approach and ultimately lead to more effective and efficient and better evaluation of things like wellbeing initiatives that universities can roll out. So I guess that's some of the practical implications of the work I've done to date, but would obviously like to do a lot more, particularly around the work-life balance and helping students to manage that.
Well, maybe that leads us perfectly into where do you hope to go from here? I know you have a funded PhD studentship, which is advertised right now, and we'll link to that in the show notes for anyone who's interested. So, can you tell us a bit more about what that PhD project aims to do?
Yes, definitely. So my work today is really looked at student well-being and what's important to measure, to look at when we're talking about student well-being. But when you look at the university as a whole, obviously we have students, we have student services staff, we have people who work in as lecturers, we have managers, we have all sorts of people who are all part of the university community, whereas most research has looked at well-being from a very individual perspective, either looking at well-being in university students or looking at well-being in academic staff, and not kind of looking at what are the shared important facets of well-being for those groups when we're looking at the university community as a whole. So community well-being is quite a tricky construct to define. in all sorts of communities, including, actual communities, physical communities, towns, and so on. It's about kind of the economic, social, political, environmental, cultural conditions that are important to a particular community, and how satisfied they are with those conditions at the moment, to get that kind of sense of community well-being. And nobody's really looked at this in universities as a community, but we're asked about community quite often. The National Student Survey asks about community, and are students satisfied with the community that they've experienced at the university. But I guess what this PhD is wanting to look at is, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to students? What does it mean to staff who work in universities? And to develop a kind of framework of university community well-being, drawing on those perspectives, which is very in line with the whole university perspective that's currently being advocated by key organisations like Student Minds, Universities UK, and so on. So it's taken the university as a whole rather than a very individual perspective, rather than just looking at people fill out a well-being questionnaire and then the sense of well-being in that group is determined by aggregated scores across that group of people. It's kind of broader than that. So that's what we are interested in looking at.
And do you have any ideas about what kind of skills a successful candidate might have, or what kind of prior knowledge they might need?
I think being really interested in listening to people's stories and understanding, different people's perspectives, and able to obviously draw out links between what people are saying. So those kind of qualitative skills, but also there will be an element of quantitative work within this as well. So that's important. A background in psychology would be ideal, or obviously a very linked discipline, because this is very much from a psychological perspective. And just, I guess, a passion for well-being in universities and for mental health research more broadly, I guess.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much for telling us about your research and about this PhD studentship. Where can people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Alyson Dodd, and annoyingly I always have to spell that because it's spelled with a Y, so ALYSON DODD. And then obviously I have a profile on the Northumbria University website.
Excellent, thank you. So listeners, if you'd like to learn more about Northumbria psychology, check out our psychology department blog at northumbriapsy.com. This is also where you can find links to all the funded PhD studentships, which we are currently advertising. The deadlines for applications are February 18th. You can follow the psychology department on Twitter as well at NorthumbriaPSY. If you'd like to be interviewed on the podcast or know someone who would, please email me at genevieve.brown@northumbria.ac.uk. Finally, if you liked the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our podcast on your listening app and give us a review and rating. I hope you've learned something on this voyage into the mind. Take care until next time.